A diver went looking for trash and found a secret buried for 30 years. He thought it was just debris until his hand hit a steel door. It was an armored truck, sealed shut, rusted, and hidden in silence. Inside, not money, not treasure, but something so shocking, it turned a forgotten cold case into national headlines. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's get started. Samuel Dorn had always felt more alive beneath the surface than above it. On land, life moved too fast, too loud, too chaotic. But underwater, the world whispered instead of shouted. It was the only place where time slowed, where he could finally breathe, even with a regulator in his mouth. That's why Echo Ridge Lake wasn't just a destination for him, it was a sanctuary. He lived in a weathered cabin tucked deep in the woods, close enough to the lake that he could hear the water lap against the shore from his bedroom window. The place looked abandoned to most, roof half collapsed. Porch cluttered with scuba gear, ropes, tangled nets, and an old metal detector that hadn't worked right in years. But to Samuel, it was home. Inside, dusty frames lined one shelf, a younger version of himself and his older brother. Aaron, grinning with fishing poles in hand, and right in the center, a faded photograph of Samuel with a boy named Caleb. Both 15, both full of life. But Caleb never made it past that summer. And from that day on, Samuel couldn't leave the lake, because the lake had taken something from him, and deep down, he believed it still held answers. That evening, the lake shimmered beneath a sky streaked in fading gold and soft lavender. The kind of quiet that wrapped around Samuel Dorn's ribs like a question waiting to be answered. He stood at the edge of the dock, his wetsuit half zipped, hands steady despite the fluttering unease that had settled into his chest. He'd dived nearly every part of Echo Ridge Lake in his years living here. Not for sport, not for fame, but to clean, to listen, to remember. He had pulled out everything from glass bottles to forgotten toys to rusted bicycles that still had baseball cards clipped to the spokes. Each item, like a memory, the lake had coughed up. But today felt different. For weeks now, there'd been a persistent tug in his thoughts, a spot he had always avoided. A deeper shelf, just past the northern cove, where the lake bed dropped into a basin so dark and cold it felt like descending into the lungs of the earth itself. Samuel had reached that edge before, but turned back every time. The silt there rose in suffocating clouds. Visibility dropped to nothing, and the water's temperature turned bitter, unnatural. Divers he spoke to called it cursed. But tonight, something pressed him toward it. He clicked his headlamp into place, tugged the straps of his buoyancy vest tight, and lowered himself into the water. The cold rose fast first to his chest, then his neck, then swallowed his head as he slipped beneath. His fins kicked steadily, slow, measured. He passed submerged logs, moss-covered stones, and the twisted branches of drowned trees. Schools of small fish scattered at his presence. Then came the slope, the edge of the world. He let the current guide him downward, adjusting the pressure in his ears, watching the light from above thin into pale strands before it vanished completely. He flicked on his dive torch. It carved a narrow path through the gloom like a blade. The silence was total, broken only by the hiss of air through his regulator and the steady thump of his heart. He unclipped the metal detector from his belt and swept it gently across the floor. A few dull pulses, scrap metal, a rusted pipe, nothing new. He dropped each into the mesh bag clipped at his side. And then, beep! A loud, insistent screech. Samuel froze. The detector's handle vibrated with an intensity he'd never felt before. He knelt slowly into the silt, careful not to disturb too much. Bubbles danced around his mask as he exhaled. He swept the device again. Beep, 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 beep! Whatever it was massive. He reached out with one gloved hand and brushed the lake bed gently. The silt slipped away like powder, revealing something flat and cold beneath. Metal. Smooth. Too smooth to be natural. His breath caught in his throat. He kept brushing. The shape stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the darkness. His light caught the faintest glimpse of a corner, then a seam. Then a door handle. Samuel's pulse spiked. It was a vehicle. And not just any vehicle. This was no sunken pickup or lost pontoon boat. This was large, industrial. His torch revealed more as he drifted alongside it. Thick panels, reinforced steel, bolted hinges. A truck. No, an armored truck. His thoughts raced. A long-lost crime story clawed its way back to memory, something about a missing vehicle, stolen cash, and two guards who had vanished into myth decades ago. The kind of story people told around campfires, but never believed. But here it was. Real. Resting silently beneath the lake like a relic from a buried war. He hovered above the back door, his hand trailing the rusted surface. The metal had eroded. Algae clung to every groove. But it was unmistakable this truck had been sealed shut for a very long time. His dive computer chirped a warning. Low air. Reluctantly, he pulled back. He couldn't go further, not tonight. He gave the truck one last look, its monstrous silhouette fading into the clouded water behind him. His ascent was slow, his thoughts anything but. What was it doing here? Had anyone else ever gotten this close? Was he the first? The surface broke above him with a sharp gasp. The sky was now dark, stars starting to scatter overhead. Lights from the shoreline flickered in the distance. But Samuel didn't swim towards them right away. He floated, staring down, because something had changed. This wasn't about trash or old regrets anymore. This, whatever this was, felt like a story the lake had decided he was finally ready to hear. A story hidden beneath 30 years of silence, silt, and sorrow. And now, like it or not, it was his. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Samuel Dorn lay awake in the dark, the ceiling above him glowing faintly with the shifting light of passing headlights from the distant highway. His dive bag sat in the corner, damp and untouched since he'd come back hours earlier. But his thoughts weren't in the room. They were 40 feet beneath the surface of Echo Ridge Lake, pressed against cold metal and silence. The image of the truck haunted him, not just its presence, but what it meant. For 3 decades, local lore had treated the armored truck like a ghost story. In 1989, 2 security guards transporting a small fortune in cash had vanished. The vehicle was never found. Some said it was a setup. Others whispered that one guard had killed the other and made off with the money. Conspiracy theories had bloomed like algae in summer. But now Samuel knew one thing for certain. The truck never left Echo Ridge. And whatever had happened in that metal coffin, it hadn't been peaceful. At dawn, mist floated like breath across the surface of the lake. Samuel stood in his wetsuit once more, breath fogging in the cool air. He didn't hesitate this time. He stepped into the water like it was waiting for him. The descent felt heavier now, not just physically but emotionally. He wasn't diving for debris. He was diving into a mystery that had swallowed men whole. As he approached the basin again, the visibility dropped. His dive light cut through like a scalpel, and there it was. The truck, waiting, unmoved. But this time, Samuel had come prepared. He unclipped a small underwater camera from his belt and secured it to his chest. He checked the feed, then turned his attention to the front of the vehicle. The cab. Last time, he hadn't gotten close enough to investigate it. This time, he intended to understand what had happened, and maybe... Why? He drifted toward the front of the truck, brushing aside kelp and thick reeds that had grown around its tires. The glass was shattered. Inside, the driver's seat was collapsed inward, warped by pressure and time. But something glinted in the sediment near the floorboards. Samuel hovered. Slowly, he reached down and brushed away a layer of silt. His fingers froze. It was a handgun, still intact, half buried but unmistakable. A chill crept down his spine. He swept his dive light to the side, revealing more damage inside the cab. The metal dash was bent. The steering wheel twisted unnaturally. It looked like someone had struggled, like someone had tried to get out. But the doors were sealed shut with rust. If anyone had been inside, they never made it far. Then came a sound. Not from above, not from his equipment. From inside, a low, dull thud. Samuel instinctively backed away, heart thundering. He stared at the truck, watching for movement, but everything was still. Maybe it was a rock. Maybe it was pressure shifting. Or maybe it was just the weight of his own imagination catching up to him. But still, it felt like a warning. His next stop was the rear, the cargo compartment. He followed the truck's side, counting steps, estimating distance. The camera on his chest blinked steadily, recording everything. The back door came into view. One hinge was barely hanging on. The other was completely swallowed by rust. He moved in closer, running a gloved hand along the seam. His light caught something. Letters. Faint, faded, but still there. D. Rhodes, Blake Unit 47, Secure Line Transport. His breath caught. Those were the names. Daniel Rhodes and Arthur Blake, the two missing guards. He hovered in place, paralyzed by the weight of history pressing against his chest. He didn't know these men, but in this moment, they felt impossibly close, trapped in metal, forgotten by time, left with no one to speak for them. Until now. He pulled a small pry tool from his gear and wedged it into the rusted seam of the door. He didn't plan to force it open, not alone, but he wanted to see if there was any give. He twisted. The metal groaned, just slightly. Then, a rush of bubbles exploded from beneath the door. Samuel recoiled, heart racing. Silt swirled in all directions, blinding him for several seconds. He backed up, hands trembling. When the cloud cleared, he saw it. Through the narrow crack now open in the door, something pale floated free. A piece of fabric? No, a uniform sleeve? And attached to it, a human arm. Samuel's world narrowed to a tunnel. He blinked, unable to look away. The limb drifted gently in the current, still connected to the body inside. Someone was in there! Still in there. All this time. He surfaced minutes later, lungs aching, heart thudding in his chest like a drumbeat of dread. As he pulled off his mask, the wind cut across his face, but he barely noticed. His world had just cracked open. This wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a grave. Back at his cabin, Samuel reviewed the camera footage in stunned silence. The outline of the truck, the gun, the arm, the names on the steel. It was all there, but he knew he couldn't carry this alone anymore. He picked up his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed. Echo Ridge Sheriff's Office. A voice answered. This is Deputy Langston. Samuel swallowed hard. My name is Samuel Dorn, he said, and I think I just found something you've been looking for a very long time. The knock came less than an hour after he ended the call. Samuel stood at the end of his drive, still in his damp clothes, as two sheriff's vehicles pulled onto the gravel path outside his cabin. The tires crunched slowly, like the weight of what they were about to uncover had already settled in their bones. Deputy Langston was the first out, mid-40s, wide-shouldered, cautious. The other officer, a younger woman named Carter, glanced toward the lake before approaching Samuel. "You said you found what exactly?" Langston asked. Samuel didn't speak right away. He simply held out his waterproof camera and hit play. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, grainy, but unmistakable. The silhouette of the armored truck, the rusted lettering, the gun, the sleeve, and the arm. Langston's face hardened. Carter took a step back, muttering under her breath. "No way." Samuel finally spoke, his voice quiet. "It's real, and there's someone still in it." By mid-afternoon, the lake was no longer silent. Crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze as law enforcement cordoned off the dock area. News of the discovery spread faster than the ripples across the water. Investigators arrived. Dive teams were summoned. Curious locals gathered at the tree line, whispering, pointing. Samuel stood back from it all, watching as his quiet sanctuary transformed into a full-blown crime scene. He felt split. One part of him wanted to vanish into the trees, to let the professionals take over and erase his presence from this entire thing. But the other part knew he couldn't leave now. Not when he was the only one who had touched the truck. Not when he had seen it, felt it. Not when he'd heard the lake whisper truths no one else had listened for. The lead investigator, Sheriff Reese Calder, arrived just before sundown. He was a serious man in his 50s, with deep lines around his eyes and a sharp, steady way of speaking. "You the diver?" he asked, approaching Samuel. "Yes, Spencer," Samuel replied. Calder didn't offer a handshake, just a nod. "You understand what you've stumbled onto?" Samuel hesitated. "I think so. It's not just a truck. It's a time capsule." Calder squinted. "No, it's a crime scene, and possibly the answer to a 30-year mystery that's haunted this town." Samuel didn't argue. He just handed Calder the dive coordinates and quietly offered to lead the dive team himself. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "Suit up?" The second descent was colder. Not physically. His wetsuit protected him, but emotionally. The first time he'd gone down alone. Now. There were 3 divers behind him, breathing in sync, carrying sonar gear and underwater lighting. The lake seemed more reluctant this time, like it sensed what was coming, like it knew that its oldest secret was about to be exhumed. As they reached the truck, the divers fanned out. Samuel guided them with hand signals, pointing to the back door, then to the side panel where the lettering was carved. One of the officers approached the crack Samuel had pried open. He cleared the silt and flinched. There it was again, the arm, still gently drifting, even behind their masks. Samuel could see the shift in the divers' expressions. This wasn't folklore anymore. This was fact, and facts had weight. Back on shore, the plan changed fast. The truck had to come up. A heavy-duty winch was called in. Boats were positioned. Ropes prepared. Samuel stood beside the sheriff, watching as the cable disappeared beneath the surface. "Do you think we'll find both of them?" Calder asked quietly. Samuel nodded. "If the lake let go of one, it'll let go of the other." The sheriff glanced at him sideways. "You talk like the lake's alive." Samuel gave a sad smile. "You dive here long enough, you start to think maybe it is." The winch whined and groaned for hours. The tension was unbearable. The crowd behind the tape grew. More news vans, more flashbulbs, the hum of speculation louder than the wind. Then it broke the surface. Water exploded upward as the truck surged into the open air like a beast being pulled from its cave. It was monstrous rusted, discolored, windows blown out like hollow eyes. And then something dropped. Something pale. A human skull, Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even seasoned officers stepped back. A few turned away. The lake had just spoken loudly. The truck slammed onto the dock with a final groan. Water poured from its frame like the last breath of the dead. Silence followed. Thick, heavy. Samuel didn't move. He couldn't. The coroner arrived within the hour. Forensic tents were erected, photos taken. Gloves snapped into place. The rear doors of the truck were pried open with tools and prayer. Inside, everything was soaked in time. Moldy canvas bags, mummified bundles of money. And in the far corner, slumped like he'd been waiting, a skeleton, mostly intact. Uniform fragments clung to the bone. A rusted badge. A name tag barely legible Daniel Rhodes. The first guard. And the lies people told about him for decades cracked into dust. He hadn't run. He hadn't stolen anything. He'd died here, in the dark, alone. Samuel turned away. Grief gnawing at his ribs. Not grief for someone he knew, but for someone no one had grieved for properly in 30 years. And that was when he saw it. In the mud-caked corner of the cargo bay, a second revolver. Still loaded. Untouched. Sheriff Calder stood behind him. Lips thin. No shots fired. The forensics lead shook her head. Not from this weapon, which means... Calder's voice turned grave. He didn't shoot back. Samuel whispered. Then someone else pulled the trigger. The evidence was overwhelming. 2 guards, 1 dead, 1 missing, until a second body was recovered days later, near the driver's seat. Slumped, still strapped in. Dental records confirmed it. Arthur Blake, the one they thought had escaped with the money. He hadn't run. He drowned. And tucked beneath his seat, inside a rusted box that had somehow survived the pressure, was a journal. A confession. Blake had planned the heist, had shot Rhodes during the struggle, but panic overtook him. The truck careened off the road. Water surged, locks jammed. He died beside the man he betrayed. Back on the shoreline, Samuel stared at the lake. Everything had changed. The truth had surfaced, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like mourning. The lake wasn't just a place anymore. It was a witness. And it had waited decades for someone to listen. Samuel had listened. And now, the lake would never be the same. Neither would he. The headlines spread like wildfire. Cold case solved after 30 years. Local diver uncovers armored truck in Echo Ridge Lake. Forgotten truth resurfaces. 1 guard innocent, 1 consumed by guilt, the diver who listened to the lake. And at the center of every story was a name that had never wanted the spotlight, Samuel Dorn. He watched from behind curtains as vans with satellite dishes rolled down the quiet gravel road toward his cabin. Journalists camped near the trailhead. Strangers left notes tucked into his door frame. Some wanted autographs. Others wanted interviews. A few just said thank you in shaky handwriting. But Samuel didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like anything except tired. And yet, the world kept knocking. The knock that changed everything came not from a reporter, but from a state official. A tall woman in a navy blazer introduced herself with a badge and a folder. She didn't smile much. You're listed as the sole civilian who discovered and reported the Echo Ridge armored truck, she said. Under State Code 712B. Section 6, you're entitled to a finder's compensation. Samuel blinked. A what? She opened the folder. Inside was a number, one he had to read 3 times to believe. 492 Oscars. His voice cracked. This can't be real. She nodded. The bank that owned the funds dissolved in 2001. Their assets were never claimed. The money, though water-damaged, is being restored. You're eligible for a full percentage. This check is your advance. She slid it across the table. Samuel stared at it. A lifetime of debt. Repairs he couldn't afford. Dive gear that barely worked. Medical bills. Forgotten plans. And now this. Wealth, real, unexpected, undeserved. He said nothing for a long time. The official stood. You have 30 days to claim or decline. Either way, Mr. Dorn, the lake isn't the only thing that's changed. That night, Samuel sat at the same wooden table where he'd repaired regulators and stitched torn wetsuits for years. Now it held a piece of paper that could rewrite his entire life. He could leave, move somewhere warm. He could buy a boat, upgrade his gear, never worry again. He could finally patch the roof. But all he could see when he looked at the check was a skull falling from the side of that truck, was a loaded revolver that had never been fired, was the name Daniel Rhodes cleared only after death, was the body of a man who died clawing at a steel door, begging the water not to take him. And floating all around those images, like leaves in murky current, was one cold truth. That money had been meant for something evil. It had bought betrayal, and now it was being offered to him like a reward. The next morning, he did what he always did when his thoughts got too loud. He dove. Echo Ridge Lake was quiet again. The crime scene tape had come down. The divers and the press were gone. The surface looked like it had never been disturbed. But it had. And so had Samuel. He swam along the edge of the basin, the very place where the truck had slept for decades, and looked down at the lake bed. The silt had begun to settle. Algae were returning. Schools of fish darted through shadow. The lake was healing. And that's when it hit him. So could the town. 3 days later, Samuel stood in front of the county commission in an old flannel shirt, holding the check. The room was quiet. I don't want this, he said. Murmurs spread across the hall. He raised a hand. I don't mean I don't need it. God knows I do. But this money, it's not mine. It came from something that took 2 lives. I don't want to build a future on top of that. The silence turned solemn. I want every dollar to go back into this town, into Echo Ridge Lake, into teaching kids to respect the water, into memorials for the men who died, into something clean, something real. One commissioner whispered, He's serious. Samuel nodded. The lake gave me peace once. I think it can do the same for others. By summer, the transformation had begun. With Samuel's funds, the county launched a full restoration of Echo Ridge Lake. Specialists arrived to test water quality, remove industrial debris, and plant new aquatic ecosystems. A diving education program was founded in Samuel's name. Children who once feared the dark depths now signed up in droves, masks too big for their small faces, laughter echoing over the rippling surface. And beside the lake, a carved stone, in memory of Daniel Rhodes and in forgiveness of Arthur Blake. We remember, we restore, we rise. Samuel never took a dime, but what he got in return couldn't be bought. The respect of a town that once ignored him, the purpose he didn't know he needed, and the quiet comfort of a lake that no longer whispered in grief but hummed with healing. One evening, as children practiced diving near the cove, Samuel sat on the end of the dock, feet dangling in the water. The sun dipped behind the trees. The surface shimmered like glass, and in that moment, he knew. The discovery at the bottom of the lake had changed everything. But what mattered most was what he chose to do with it. The lake was changing, and so was Samuel. In the months that followed the recovery of the armored truck, Echo Ridge transformed from a forgotten town into a place people actually wanted to visit. Volunteers cleaned the shoreline, new walkways were built, the water was tested weekly, and the results posted proudly on a community board outside the ranger's cabin. And Samuel, he became something between a myth and a mentor. Children who once feared the lake now waved to him every morning, calling him Mr. Sam the diver. Teenagers listened when he taught them how to respect the water, not just its depth, but its silence. And yet, even as the surface healed, something below still pulled at him. A shadow, a question, a feeling that something wasn't finished. It came back to him late one night, as he was reviewing sonar scans with one of the new divers, Liam, a bright 19-year-old who had joined the youth diving initiative. "I've been mapping the basin," Liam said. "This section here," he pointed at a jagged contour line on the screen. "It doesn't match anything on the topographic charts from the 90s. Samuel leaned in. A strange dip, like an indentation, a structure. "I thought that was the truck," Liam asked. Samuel shook his head. "The truck was 60 feet west of this." The boy frowned. "Then what is that?" Samuel didn't answer, because he didn't know, but he could feel it again, that flutter in his chest, like the lake was trying to speak. The next morning, Samuel was already suiting up before the sun broke the tree line. He didn't bring a team this time, didn't file a permit. He just packed the basics: flashlight, sonar, and a camera, and a hunch. The water was glass smooth as he slipped beneath, the cold familiar now, almost comforting. He followed the new coordinates carefully, each kick pushing him deeper toward the unexplored edge of the basin. His heart thudded harder the closer he got, not out of fear, but anticipation. Something waited here, something the lake hadn't revealed yet. And then the sonar pinged, a low, steady beep that grew sharper as he drifted forward. The shape emerged slowly, obscured by sediment and time. Another vehicle? But smaller, sleeker, almost completely buried. Samuel's breath hitched in his mask. He cleared the silt gently. A headlight. A broken mirror. It wasn't another truck. It was a car. A black sedan? And on the rear bumper, barely visible beneath grime, was a state government emblem. Back on shore, Samuel examined the footage frame by frame. The license plate was half intact. The interior, impossible to see clearly, but he could make out something white on the driver's side. A piece of paper, a badge. He didn't know yet. But what he did know was this. The armored truck wasn't the only thing the lake had buried. When Samuel brought the new discovery to Sheriff Calder, the room went still. Calder rubbed his jaw. "You think this is connected?" "I don't know," Samuel replied, "but it's not a coincidence." Calder sighed. 3 decades ago, this case went cold so fast it made people nervous. No suspects, no motive, just silence. And now we've got a second vehicle from that era, less than 100 feet from where we found the first. He looked up. "I think we just reopened the case." The car was recovered 2 days later under full investigation protocol. Unlike the truck, it had decayed more rapidly, the thinner frame no match for decades of water pressure. Still, forensic teams worked methodically, and what they found inside would change everything again. In the passenger side footwell, they recovered a briefcase. Inside, several bound stacks of untraceable cash. A burner revolver. A letter of resignation, unsigned, and tucked inside a plastic sleeve. An FBI field agent's ID. The lake didn't just hold greed. It held corruption, buried not only with guilt but with power. That night, Samuel sat at the end of the dock again, staring at the lights reflecting off the water. Everything he thought had ended was just beginning again. This wasn't just a story about a heist gone wrong. It was bigger, dirtier. Someone powerful had wanted this secret to stay buried. And maybe, just maybe, someone had helped make sure it was. Samuel had once believed the lake had taken enough from him. But now he realized the lake wasn't the one doing the taking. It was the people who tried to silence it. And the lake had waited for the right person to listen, to uncover not just bones, but truth. The seasons shifted slowly in Echo Ridge. What was once a sleepy lakeside town overshadowed by a 30-year silence had transformed like the lake itself into something unrecognizable. Something awake. And at the center of that awakening stood a man who never asked to be seen. Samuel Dorn never wanted to be a hero. He didn't dive to be remembered. He dove to forget. But now, his name lived in headlines, in documentaries, in history books that would one day be taught in local schools. The man who found the armored truck. The man who turned down a fortune. The man who listened to the lake. After the discovery of the second vehicle, after the FBI's quiet arrival, and the reopening of a case long buried in federal archives, Samuel knew he had a choice. He could disappear. He could return to the silence that once comforted him. But something inside had changed. It wasn't just the lake that had called him back to life. It was what he had become through it. Weeks later, standing before a packed auditorium in the town's newly renovated Civic Hall, Samuel took a breath and stepped to the podium. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't hold a speech. Just a quiet presence and a story. "My name is Samuel Dorn," he began, voice steady but raw, "and I've spent more time underwater than most people spend with their families." A ripple of light laughter moved through the crowd, but it faded quickly as he continued. "I used to think the lake was where I went to escape, but I see now it was where I went to face the truth." He paused, searching the rows of eyes staring back at him. "I found a truck full of bones and money, and that changed everything. But what changed me wasn't the discovery. It was what came after." Samuel looked down for a moment. "I found out how easy it is to walk away with a reward and call it closure. But real closure that comes from doing something good with what you know. It comes from facing the ghosts, even when you don't want to." A hush fell over the crowd. He continued, voice thick now. "The lake gave me back something I thought I'd lost a long time ago. It gave me purpose. It gave me clarity. And it reminded me that the hardest choices are the ones that make you who you really are." He stepped back. The room stood with him. Not for the money, not for the mystery, but for the man who had finally allowed himself to rise above it. In the weeks that followed, Samuel returned to the lake again and again. Not as a guardian, not as a celebrity, but as a teacher. He founded the Echo Ridge Diving Academy, where children learned to respect water, to treat it not as a threat, but as something living, something worth protecting. He taught them how to breathe deeply when things felt overwhelming, how to descend slowly, how to rise steadily even when everything below seemed heavy. And in every lesson, without saying the words, he taught them what he had learned the hard way, that the past may be buried, but it still matters. That silence doesn't mean peace, and that the greatest discoveries happen inside you, not beneath the surface. One morning, a young boy in his class, barely 10, asked Samuel as he was suiting up, "Mr. Dorn, are you ever scared of what's down there?" Samuel paused, knelt down, and looked him in the eye. "All the time," he said softly. "But I've learned something." The boy tilted his head. "What?" "That the things we're most afraid of usually just want to be understood." On the 1-year anniversary of the truck's discovery, the town of Echo Ridge held a small ceremony at the water's edge. There were no cameras, no speeches, just 2 plaques. One for Daniel Rhodes, whose loyalty was finally honored. One for Arthur Blake, whose final moments were tragic but human. And between them, a single line etched in stone. What was buried in silence was raised with truth. Samuel stood there, wind brushing against his weathered face, the water at his feet clear and calm. He thought of Caleb, his childhood friend who drowned when they were just boys. He thought of all the years he spent punishing himself in silence, diving again and again, hoping the lake would give something back. And now he understood. It had, not all at once, But piece by piece, the lake had taken, but it had also given. And Samuel had given too. Everything. As the sun dipped low behind the tree line, Samuel walked the shoreline one last time, stopping to help a student tighten their mask, to offer a wave to a father skipping stones with his daughter, to nod at the sheriff who now stood more as a friend than an authority. He didn't need applause. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted peace. And he had finally found it. Not in the silence, but in listening. That night, as stars spilled across the sky and the lake reflected them like a second universe, Samuel stood barefoot at the edge of the dock, breathing in the cool air. He closed his eyes. He remembered the sound of the regulator, the weight of the silt, the echo of his heartbeat the day he first touched that rusted door. And he whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." To the lake, to the silence, to the pain that shaped him. And then, as gently as the water itself, he dove, not to escape, not to search, not to atone, but simply to be. Anyone can face the depths if they're willing to listen long enough, and brave enough to stay when the truth surfaces. As the last light of day faded over Echo Ridge Lake, Samuel Dorn stood at the edge of the dock, the water calm and unassuming beneath him. He opened his worn dive log one final time, not to plan another descent, but to write something new, a promise, a vision, a future where the lake would no longer be a place of silence, but of learning, of healing. What began as one man's quiet escape had become something far greater. Samuel understood now that the truth he uncovered wasn't meant to stay with him alone. It belonged to the families who waited decades for answers, to the children learning not to fear the water, but respect it, to every person who had been told to look away, to let the past stay buried. The diver who once descended to escape his pain had become the man who rose carrying truth for others. Because for Samuel, and for those who follow his path, the lake was never just a place of loss. It was the beginning of purpose. The end? Up next, 2 more unforgettable, true inspired stories you won't want to miss. Click to continue the journey, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe that truth, courage, and compassion are always worth diving for.